One of the first things that is super different about Elden Ring is the scale of this game, right? It's so much bigger than anything FromSoft has ever done before. And in fact, it's so much bigger than a lot of other games out right now.
The way that this game has approached the open world design has created a big chasm between what I expected and what it actually was. I don't think I could have hoped for it to be as densely packed with carefully molded content that feels it has a sharp human touch to it. But I didn't expect that going in, right? I really thought like this would be potentially a step back in terms of the quality and level of polish that I expect.
The planning for this must have been insane. I can't imagine how they as developers could have sat down and mapped out each of the various 5 or 6 total regions of this game, then had all the sub regions within that and the sub dungeons and cities or towns and sub underground areas that you could reach. It felt as if they really planned for something so much bigger than I think any developer could have expected to accomplish, and yet somehow they actually came through with it. Maybe some of this is because in many ways Elden Ring is a culmination of a long history that FromSoft has been building. You know, since Demon Souls, they've been using a lot of these base mechanics and a lot of the same equipment and weaponry and similar lore and similar horror style of world, and they've gotten very good at that thing. And they get to reuse a lot of that stuff. And I don't mean reuse in a negative way, like a lazy way. Like they get to use hundreds of pieces of equipment, and that now gets doled out over an extensive hundreds of hours, so that you really feel like you're constantly gaining new things, and this equipment feels usable and it feels useful the whole way through, because I think it was already in past games. You know, it's one of the benefits of them having been around and really honing this type of game.
The style of enemy placement and the use of space in the world is something that has really become the thing that I look for more than looking for specific rewards in the world or a specific landmark. It's not a game that I think would be improved by, seeing little icons appearing or side missions. Those things to an extent are in there, but they're not in there to the extent that they inundate you in order to make you feel like the world is packed. It's only in there to the extent that you can choose to engage with like just the little moments in the world. Like there are these little moments, whether it's combat encounters or conversations, that can make you feel like this is almost like essentially a regular FromSoft game that isn't an open world game. Most of the time it feels like it isn't open world, right? It feels like you might as well not be able to infinitely explore up the top of a mountain, right? Even though you can, it feels like that would be unnecessary for the level of adventure that you're having just going down a narrow corridor.
I think the way they organize the trails actually fits that. Because you can, like, just in the very first place, Limgrave, which when I played through Limgrave, I kind of almost thought that was going to be the whole world. I mean, it seemed reasonable at the time that would be the extent of what this open world is going to offer. But you could just follow the trails in Limgrave and you will encounter a good chunk of what is there, right? Yes, there's stuff that you'll miss. You will miss some dungeons. You'll miss a few little encounters here and there, and especially some potential quests. But you're going to get a lot of the Dark Souls experience that way. This game feels self-consciously designed around a fan base with high expectations of density. People who play these FromSoft games know what FromSoft is capable of in terms of world design in a very tightly compacted space. And it felt as if even though these developers were trying to make something much, much bigger, they refused to go too far away from the high watermark that they had already set by themselves in prior games. And they knew that fans would expect, look, like if I wanted to play Assassin's Creed, I would play that. If I wanted to play any number of this inundation of open world designs that we've had, then you could just do that. And FromSoft isn't that kind of developer. That's not what they're known for in the slightest. And so if they were going to do the open world, they would have to do it their way. They could have stopped with just one region or two. They kept going and going and going. I kind of wonder if there was this feeling like they were trying to capture something new with this game that was a little different, reminding you of how small you are in this bigger space. And maybe that's what they were trying to give, and I certainly felt some of that as the regions expanded more and more, and I started to see more and more what was actually in this game. It's definitely much larger than I could have ever expected.
I think when I went down a certain elevator that brings you to the sort of new bottom portion of the map and realized that there is an entire map underneath the other map, that was when I felt like the game had played an amazing joke on me, and I was in on the joke at that point, and I just enjoyed this feeling of like, oh, I'm never going to finish this. I'm never going to have enough time to actually explore every inch of this world, and I'm just going to enjoy looking for the next thing. I'm just going to enjoy going around these corners and just playing it like I'm telling my own story, right? It feels like a real role-playing experience in that sense. I'm not playing it as a video game player who has been trained to desire this like completionist satisfaction. And the game actually does a pretty consistent job of providing really disappointing quantifiable rewards. And by giving you those disappointing quantifiable rewards, such as, for example, a mushroom at the end of like a very long, difficult path of enemies, it'll give you something useless at the end. And that isn't disappointing because it replaces that quantifiable reward with this unquantifiable bliss that cannot be replicated by other games.
Yeah, it forces you to appreciate the journey, not the end. They must have a sense that a lot of people are playing for the opportunity for choice. Right? Or the sense that, look, we're going to give you enough so that New Game Plus is really where you're going to define yourself. And this first journey is really just about discovery. The whole game is discovery. That Siofra River well elevator, the one where you're going down and down and down, you described it as like a joke. It's a perfect analogy because it's like building to a punchline. Yeah. You're going down and down and down, and it's so long. It just feels like, am I being messed with? This is so counter to expectation. And then you see night sky underground. It's like literally a punchline. It's exactly a joke. They know that there is expectations built around this type of game, and they are playful with how to contend with that, how to toy with some of those expectations. You played a character without a shield. That seems like so much harder than how I play. I play with a shield. I'm very like careful. I use magic from afar. I'm all about defense. You took an offensive route.
I think my reasoning comes down to probably the essence of how I view FromSoft games. I've always felt like the game provides you with so many tools for making things more straightforward for yourself, and it also provides you with so many interesting options if you want to choose a more difficult route, that really it's a game that allows you to customize your experience in almost every way. I love exploring the world and sort of exploring what the game looks like playing it in a consistent way. My limitation on myself is a way of looking at like, is this game actually going to hold up to this playstyle? Because it holds up to so many other playstyles. You know, you can use magic, you can use shields, you can use different kinds of slow and fast weapons. There's so many different advantages and disadvantages you can give yourself. And so I chose to make my home in this playstyle that really relies on paying attention to the animation and allows me to appreciate more how carefully done those are. Dodge rolling just feels like an experiment that I'm running in order to find out just how deep the rabbit hole goes of how specific and sort of fine-tuned the animations of FromSoft can be.
And how much your build can adapt to the situation, right? And this is where the open world really makes sense for a FromSoft game. You're inundated with choices all the time. Crafting, you and I didn't do it that much, but the fact that you have hundreds of items that you can craft at any time, and everywhere you go in the world, in fact, your main interaction with that open world is collecting materials for this eventual crafting that you might need to do someday. That is an option that's always there, and the whole basis of crafting is situational, right? It's making you pay attention to the difference in your situation. And that's something so different from a lot of other open world games. Like, so much of what makes an open world game kind of stale over time is that you get so used to the situations that you're in, and they're repetitive by nature. So you kind of master those types of situations. Now, of course, Elden Ring has repetition. It has ruins again and again. It has similar castle type buildings again and again. It has similar caves again and again. It has similar mines again and again. It has these things that, because there aren't markers pre-done on the map, you notice less often how repetitive they are, but they are repetitive in terms of the actual assets used. However, the challenge attached to each of these shifts as the game goes along. The game is forever creative about how to test the build that you've set up for yourself. So in your case, as someone who rolls, I imagine you've found yourself in situations where you've had to maybe change your weapon affinity or change the kind of skill that you use with your weapon. I don't know like what kind of changes you've had to do, but I imagine for me, like as a shield user, there are some enemies that can completely decimate that strategy, right? They get right past it. They take advantage of the thing that you didn't notice was your weakness. And they force you to think outside the box in terms of what do I have here. That's one of the most special things about what Elden Ring is able to do on this scale, is like give you this opportunity to really think situationally and pay attention to the nuances of whatever situation you're in.
While we're on the topic of challenging myself to use dodge rolling no matter what, I want to give a quick shout out to an optional boss by the name of Crucible Knight Ordovis, who I fought about a week ago, and it was probably the hardest experience I've ever had in any of this long string of games. I've fought many bosses by this studio. This one was a true test of my limits, the limits of my patience as a dodge rolling character specifically. It took me, I think, about 3 hours to beat this boss, and I really didn't think I was going to do it, and I wish so badly that I had recorded it.
What's the motivation to you to stick with, I'm going to roll, I'm not going to cheat? Like you could have probably affected your stats in minor ways. Like you could always at any time. In fact, this game is so much more forgiving than other FromSofts because they actually let you respec. And they give you enough of the larval tears, which is the item you use to respec. You can do it almost any time. Why not just come in with like something equivalent to the Havel armor set and just have like a giant greatsword and smash down?
I just found myself lost in the fight. I knew it was possible, even though it seemed so far out of my grasp for such a long time. And literally, I think about 20 minutes before I finally beat the boss, I texted you about it, explaining specifically why it was not possible to beat them with my technique. And then 20 minutes later, I finally did it. I had a gut feeling all along that there was some way I could do it, and I felt incredible when I was done.
FromSoft's games seem to me not merely difficult, because there are games that are just difficult. Like Cuphead is almost just difficult, or Hotline Miami is kind of difficult in that way. You really are just slamming your head against the same situation again and again, and you just memorize the techniques to persevere. FromSoft games seem to teach a more fundamental lesson about challenge. And one of those lessons is anytime you're facing something that's truly challenging, which in our blissful, privileged lives doesn't happen too often, when you really face something challenging, the inclination, I think understandably, is to immediately have self-doubt. The locus of control becomes very often external, like, oh, I can't do anything because this thing outside of me is so much far beyond what I'm capable of. And one of the major lessons about persevering through challenges is recognizing that you have more influence over that state of affairs than you realize. So in your case, when you're facing off against this boss that feels so counter to your build, which in this role-playing way that you're playing is you, and you recognize your weaknesses in that regard, I'm sure at the same time, in some sappy way, you can also recognize the strength of that style, and you adapt. You say, okay, I need to account for two enemies at once. They're both brutal in terms of the amount of poise they knock off with every hit. I have to somehow dodge and attack while they both try to attack. And yet you had to think to yourself, but I can do it. Any FromSoft game, like as hard as they get, they're not trying to kill you. They're trying to get you to think carefully about what you are capable of, and they're actually teaching you that your lack of capacity at the outset was more a lack of imagination or a lack of realization of what you were always capable of. And that's a real lesson. And this game, more than any other, does give you more alternatives, though. Some of the past FromSofts, there really were walls, ones that I think you could really feel truly stuck. And this one, it's much harder to feel truly stuck. Me as a shield-bearing character, the poise system in this game is so much better for that. Like the fact that I know that if I can do some jump attacks and then run away and then jump attack and run away, if I can just aim for lowering their poise, they will stagger. That kind of reassurance makes it feel as if I can get through almost anything. The fact that at any point I can switch out to one of the hundreds of weapons that I have. I can use the Flask of Wondrous Physic and I can switch out what kind of effect that has, and it's like, okay, worst case scenario, I'll use that you can collect great runes. One of those runes, the first one that you get, basically raises you up by 40 levels, and you can use a rune arc and you can activate that and you'll be stronger. The fact that at any point you can stealth and backstab some enemies, you have access to Ash summons. There are so many choices stacked in this game. It's constantly there, and it's like reminding you, like, look, we're trying to help you help yourself. We're not going to give it to you per se in the sense of telling you exactly what to use in the situation, but we will literally give to you everything you need for every situation. It's about you being attentive to that fact and actually taking it seriously and doing something with it.
Even just that sense of being able to choose another option psychologically leads to more resilience, I think. When you choose something that from the outside looks like a limit and looks like a cage, you'll feel like it's not a cage simply because you chose it from many appealing and available options. If you know that you could at any time step out and do something completely different, it makes it more interesting to continue on and persevere. It's easier to be strong when you know that you could seek help at any time, and the game's willing to give you that help, and so foregoing it becomes even more of an internal triumph as a result of the fact that it's your own choice.
The voluntary nature of it makes it personal. The amount of times that I've banged my head against an enemy, I know that it was voluntary, and it literally was in this game. The scale of this game is so large I could always leave, but it really felt like it mattered to me to do it. And the fact that they gave me the room to make it matter, that's where the challenge actually seems worth it. It seems worthwhile to have a game be difficult when you're actually choosing that difficulty in this sense. Obviously, they put it there so heavy in the forefront. One of the first things that you do in this game is you see the tree sentinel character, and he will smash you down. And it's like the first lesson is, look, do you want to face this guy? You're gonna die. And you're probably going to die again and again. And I know some people probably spent 3 hours facing that guy. And what's funny about that is, because I didn't do that, I ran away because I'm scared. But some people will just sit there, and that's the first fight they do, and they'll just do it. And they want to do that. That's fun in a way, that level of challenge. And it's like they're constantly like reminding you, like, look, we're giving you these moments and you get to decide. It's not just the combat that is reminding you of these things, of like lending you these opportunities. There's so much you can miss, like the quest design in this game, right? It's rough to even call it quests because it's not like there's a quest log or something. It's not like it's called quests, I don't think, in the game itself. But there's NPCs you can talk to, and if you don't pursue the right series of steps, you can miss huge sections of the game. And there's a pressure built into that because, again, that's voluntary. It's not like the game is ruined by you missing that stuff because you didn't know that you missed it. There's this trick that happens where the game is so long that if I didn't go to some of these underground, like the deep root depths as a result of Ronnie's quest, if I didn't end up getting there, how would I know? I wouldn't know. But it's that fact that I could miss it that makes me voluntarily be even more curious than I otherwise would have been. These incentives are being sort of webbed and strewn about throughout the game, making you want to care more about beating that fight, or about searching those ruins, or about veering here and there across the open world.
I think this sort of design approach really calls into question, or calls into greater focus, this idea of like, what is a developer's intent? And how much does a developer's intent matter to the player? Because at a certain point, there are so many possibilities in a game like Elden Ring that you can't possibly map out a through line of intent through all of that. They are creating an experience that they couldn't possibly predict for you. The important intent becomes your intent as the player. And you sort of get to experience not just the empowerment of that, but the struggle of that. And you get to discover the result of that, which is a sense of actual bravery, and a sense of being willing to take a risk in order to get a greater reward. It's hard to talk about difficulty in a game like Dark Souls or Bloodborne or Sekiro, because those games especially, actually, they lend a little bit of legitimacy to the idea that there is an intended path, because all of those games are more linear. So there's this sort of narrative sometimes when people talk about whether or not these games should have an easy mode or a hard mode. They say, well, the intent of the studio is to not have an easy mode. And that becomes sort of the be-all end-all argument, right? But I think one of the things that makes FromSoft so great is that they are essentially already providing you with easy modes. It just becomes a matter of like, what are you choosing to engage with? So I don't think the game would necessarily be worse off if it had an easy mode, right? It would just be one option on top of a whole pile of them.
So much of what makes the game difficult is a question of pride. If you become less prideful, you can invite an online co-op partner in to help you. If you become less prideful, you can respec and make yourself immune to whatever damage output a boss is giving you. It's all there, but again, it's that voluntary choice to decide for yourself, no, I want to role play this type of experience, and the challenge is going to match that, but I believe that I can get through it. I've heard in interviews that the whole goal of the game was for Miyazaki to give someone that genuine experience of accomplishment, and like that's all he wants to give people. It reminds me of The Witness. The Witness was a game where the puzzles were actually hard. It didn't tell you the solution, and it will often let you miss things. If you don't figure out the rule of the puzzle, you're screwed. through that whole section of that world. And it was an actual example of a real challenge, one that you could mess up. There was failure state right there on the brink. And FromSoft games are like that. They don't pander to you. And that's so satisfying in that sense. It's not that they're not pandering to you, like they're not giving you ways to make it easier, because they are. It's just that they're really making it clear to you what's the cost, and the cost has to do with your pride in many ways. Yeah. And that really feels like real. That feels like a real cost that you deal with in day-to-day life.
I think the hardest thing about experiencing a game like Elden Ring for the first time, if you're new to these kinds of games, is just getting over that hump of expecting the game to tell you what you want, to like tell you what your goals are. I think people get very confused, and I even got confused at the beginning. As we explained in the first video, I had an expectation of how well I would be guided by the guidance of grace, and that expectation was something that was making me feel frustrated. And one of the challenges that I had to overcome was realizing that I was creating that frustration with an expectation that I didn't need to have. And so much of the accomplishment of this game comes from, why am I thinking this way? Can I think another way in order to improve?
There is a question that I do want to broach, and I do think it's a controversial one. I have a confession to make. I love this game. I'm actually I really love it a lot. I think it's one of my favorites of FromSoft. And it only doesn't topple Bloodborne and Sekiro for almost aesthetic reasons. And because I just finished Bloodborne right before playing Elden Ring, and I do think that there's aspects of Bloodborne that just matches my disposition a little bit better. But the open world is so fantastic in this game. The way it handles the open world is better than almost any other open world game in terms of allowing player agency and allowing some obscurity so that the player can figure things out for themselves, such as the map not fully being clear enough so that you can't just look at the map and know what's there. You have to still traverse the terrain in order to know what's there. But I kind of wonder if the fact that it's the best of an open world makes us not notice how the open worldness of it also happens to be a major weakness in the actual experience of the game. And here's what I mean by that. My favorite aspects of the game are the aspects of the game where it's most like prior FromSofts. You're exploring the open world and you get to these sections that are so intricately designed and dense. And then you go through this seemingly empty space, and then you're back in another intricately designed and dense space. And then this became most noticeable when you get to the beginning of Altus Plateau, the area around Volcano Manor. So the area around Volcano Manor is quite linear while still being in that open world setting. Like, it's much more narrow in terms of the corridors you can traverse. And I had a much more enjoyable time in those types of spaces. And especially when you get to the capital of Leyndell and it's really tight, and you get to the sewers and it's really tight while still technically being open world. That was so much better than the Limgrave and Caelid type spaces where there's large emptiness. Now, there is a ton of value in emptiness. I actually, I have a video essay that will eventually come out called Finding the Purpose in Games That Wander, where I talk about like the value in looking out and just having a meditative state in certain games. But I don't think Elden Ring actually does that aspect of the open world best. The open world part that it does best is the other stuff, which is closer to just making you want to get to the good stuff more, to the stuff where it's actually dense again. It's a conflicting feeling I've had while playing this game.
I mean, now that you say that, I'm looking back on the way that I've approached the game, and I think I've really cut back on my exploring of the open areas. The areas that are just, where you can see off into the distance. Like those areas, I pretty much just try to find the nearest sort of old school level that I can, because first of all, the game is too huge and life is too short. But also, I just don't think, it's not that parts are bad, but it couldn't possibly compare to the quality that you experience elsewhere.
I think it makes the progression feel slower than it is, or I guess the pace feels slower than it is. The way I played through especially Limgrave and even Liurnia of the Lakes, I was searching every single nook and cranny. I've played 150 hours, and I know people have finished the game prior to hitting 150 hours, and I'm just past the Altus Plateau. And that's because I was really searching everywhere, trying not to miss anything. And that's the open world part of it making me do that, because I don't want to miss anything. because you know that you can. And I kind of think it messes up the pace. I think when you play like that, the Limgrave environment and the Liurnia of the Lakes environment, they're somewhat similar, and it makes that whole section 50 hours long. And that's a really long time to be in a similar kind of aesthetic space. And to not have the story progress very much and not have the scenery shift dramatically, which something that FromSoft does so well is having things shift all of a sudden. My girlfriend was playing, and right before Liurnia of the Lakes, she made a comment to me that the game was boring. She was a huge fan of Dark Souls, like a bigger fan than I was, because she actually played Dark Souls way before I did. She's the one who got me to play. I literally would not have played Dark Souls if it wasn't for her. Every single thing that FromSoft has created, she's played all the way through. She played Bloodborne right with me, right before Elden Ring. And she was getting frustrated with the ways in which there was a lot of wasted time that she was dealing with, trying to go through this world. And the thing that she loved the most about FromSoft games was feeling disparate, almost as if it wouldn't arrive. And I think that's a huge shame. I don't know, it's a tough contention, because I'm not trying to say that the open world's bad. I think it's actually the opposite. I think the open world's fantastic. I just don't think it's the best thing about Elden Ring, and I actually think it gets in the way. All in all, the point I'm trying to make is one of trade-offs. In this case, FromSoft decided to make the game bigger, and in that sense, it comes across as far better because you're getting more and more of what you want. But with that additional space that comes with these environments, also comes a great deal of emptiness. Also comes a great deal of getting lost and more minor activities strewn throughout the more significant legacy dungeons and ruins and spaces that are much more designed. In the trade-off of switching to this open world, there was something lost. It's not like you can make a change like this and just retain the exact same level of quality through and through that you get with a game that's far more linear. When you make a choice like this, it's going to lead to some sacrifices. In Elden Ring, the sacrifices lead to a lot of time not always feeling as fulfilling as what you would have gotten in prior titles. It's the exact same thing that happened with something like Breath of the Wild. When Zelda Breath of the Wild went into the open world, there was a certain degree of sacrifice in terms of the major dungeons and the quality of those spaces and the level of puzzle design that you're getting throughout the world. There was a lot more collection to do. There's a lot more searching involved in that world design. And Elden Ring is similar in that way, in that it sacrificed something in order to make some big gains, that there's definitely some trade-offs. All in all, obviously, Elden Ring remains fantastic. And this open world is fantastic relative to the other open worlds that are available. But what I'm trying to say is I don't know that open world is necessarily the best design choice for what FromSoft is good at. I think the best parts of this open world is the stuff that was the best parts of prior titles. And I'm hoping that going forward, they continue to experiment and they don't just get bigger and bigger and bigger in the spacious sort of way, but perhaps increase the quantity in a linear fashion in such a way that they can maintain the quality bar that they've set in prior titles. That increase that they've decided to do, that increase in quality, that increase in choice, that elevation of scale, all of that has some benefit to it, but I'm hoping that they don't lose track of what makes FromSoft so good and what makes their world so rich. That richness requires a kind of delicacy of choice moment to moment, and I hope that the open world doesn't become a temptation toward largeness that goes beyond the quality that can be maintained in that scale. Either way, Elden Ring is fantastic. I'm sure everyone agrees. It's honestly an amazing game. It's just a slight criticism that I have about the feeling of playing through that game. The length of it, it's sort of like where prior FromSoft games were poems and they had the density of poetry and they had the level of careful design that a poem has, and you can savor it and you can replay it again and again. Elden Ring feels much more like one of those epic 1,000-page novels, those ones that go on and on and on, and they can of course be incredible. They can have all the beauty of prose that you could find in the verse of poetry, but of course without a good editor it can drag on in spaces. And what I'm just saying is perhaps Elden Ring should have used a little bit more editing, a little bit more truncating down to the essence of what makes it so good, because there is a lot of great stuff in here.